to Sparks of Love. My name is Jerry Lynn Sparks, and today we have Dr. Neil Malamuth. Neil, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Jerry.
Yeah, so I know Neil, it's hard for me to call you Dr. Malamuth because I've known you as Neil for so long.
Neil, all right.
Neil's fine?
Neil's
okay.
fine.
So
sure.
Neil was the department chair at UCLA Communication Studies, and he gave me my job there. I was very grateful. I still remember when I met him, I didn't know who he was, and I was sitting in the front office of the UCLA Communication Studies office in Kinsey Hall, just waiting to be seen. And I'd probably been in there 15 minutes and no one was there. And finally he said, "Can I help you?" And you ended up being the chair of the department and, hiring me. So it was a wonderful job for an undergrad to have. So I was an office administrator.
One of the best decisions I've made. You brought
thank you.
A great deal of spark and enthusiasm to the job. So,
thank you. I would take my classes in the morning. I had 8 o'clock classes, and then classes would be over like right at 1, and I would sprint across campus to get for my shift. My shift in the comm studies was 1 to 5.
Right.
Yeah,
so they gave you exercise as well as
that's exactly right. And one of the things that's really cool about Neil is he is an expert in evolutionary psychology and hostile masculinity. And when I started planning Sparks of Love, I wanted to be sure that I interviewed a range of experts in the field of love and human relationships, communication, and you being the chair of the Communication Studies Department formerly at UCLA, it just made perfect sense. And so I was thrilled when you agreed to do it. But I thought it would be good to open for our listeners and viewers to just understand the scope of your career and what your studies have been in.
Sure. I was an undergraduate at UCLA, and I never really planned to go in the direction that I did. At the time, I was thinking of going to law school, but I was a very ambitious undergraduate. And at the time that I was studying there was a great deal of controversy and upheaval related to violence against women. There was a group of so-called radical feminists who had become very outspoken about certain kinds of media, including a billboard on Sunset Boulevard from the Rolling Stones that showed a scantily clad woman in a very sexy pose. And the title said, "I'm black and blue from the Rolling Stones and I love it."
Wow.
And this group of women not only objected to that, if I recall correctly, they somehow managed to climb up there and to splatter red paint saying, "Well, you're making money in the blood of women." And the controversy extended to other areas, including pornography, violent pornography, rape, and so forth. And I was assisting in a lab where they were studying sex and aggression from a psychoanalytic perspective. And I didn't find that very satisfying or interesting per se, but it gave me some ideas of how to do research. And I decided to take the radical feminist ideas that I really didn't know much about, but to translate them into testable hypotheses and to try to frame them in a way that research could test the ideas. And I went ahead and did actually some experiments that tested those ideas, and to my surprise, provided quite a bit of support for those ideas. And that gained suddenly a great deal of publicity. There were articles, virtually every major newspaper in the country, from New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, and so forth, about this research, and it received a lot of both praise from some quarters and criticism from other quarters.
Yeah.
So I decided, okay, I needed to address the criticism. And I went ahead and designed some further studies, and eventually that led to more research. And I was able to pursue a graduate degree and get my PhD with a plan to still go ahead to law school after. But that, for various reasons, didn't materialize.
Interesting.
And this became a research area that I focused in. And each time I would think, well, maybe another year or two and I'll wrap up and move to something else.
Yeah.
And each time, either I wound up getting some research grants, so I needed to complete more studies, or there was more criticism and controversy. So somehow it became a career topic. And while I've dabbled in a few other subjects and research areas, I pretty much continued within that same research area. And I'll just mention one more thing. And that was that I was actually invited by a radical feminist, or by at least an academic feminist, to write a critique of the evolutionary psychology approach to rape and to similar topics. So I began reading that literature with the intent of criticizing it. And to my amazement, I found that there were a lot of ideas there that really, first of all, were consistent with the radical feminist views, surprisingly.
Interesting.
And secondly, that gave me insights that I hadn't had before. And I worked on sort of bridging the gaps and what I perceived to be misleading statements on both sides, and tried to integrate some evolutionary ideas within my research on violence against women.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. When I, first met you, I was having some trouble in my marriage. I was married as an undergrad at UCLA.
Right.
And,
I remember.
Yeah. And then we split for a while, and it wasn't for any violence against women reasons, but, you flash forward almost, I think, 15 years later, and I ended up having violence against me in my marriage.
Right.
And one of the questions I had for you, and all the evolutionary psychology research that you've done, and I know you've collaborated with, I'm going to get his name wrong, Dr. David Buss, with hostile masculinity. What has been evolutionary about having violent tendencies to continue? Why, if evolutionary theory is that things that we see in today's behaviors, today's actions, had an evolutionary purpose, what purpose could violence, why does it keep getting perpetuated into our behavior sets? Why is violence continuing to be selected for?
That's a very easy question to answer, actually.
Okay.
Think for a moment about a room full of people who are nonviolent, who are peaceful, who perhaps even are pacifists, don't believe in any violence at all. And there's one person there who's willing to use violence.
Okay.
Think of the motivation to take other people's resources, to be able to take their money, their mates, and so forth, and all the other people are pacifists. Well, unfortunately, who's going to win out? Obviously. So violence is one of the tools that enabled probably humans to defeat Neanderthals and certain humans to defeat other groups. And violence is, in fact, part of the potential repertoire that we inherited from our Stone Age brain.
Yeah.
And if anything, what we need to do is set up mechanisms to reduce the likelihood that violence will occur. What age do you think human beings are actually in the life course most violent?
Teenagers.
What would you guess?
I would say teenagers.
That's what most people think.
Okay.
In fact, if you were to list all the behaviors that constitute violence, taking things by force, hitting other people and so forth, most babies would be in jail. Because as soon as babies can walk, take things and so forth, they engage in that.
Yeah.
And there's been some interesting research done on that really took that approach and monitored how often babies engage, little kids engage in violence. And they found that by far, that's the age that the most violence occurs.
So that
I was telling that to a psychiatrist friend of mine at ASU, and she was saying, no, that's not true. You know, I have 2 young children. They're not really violent. And as I was talking to her daughter, she was washing dishes and I was next to her at the sink. Her daughter was hitting her in the back, trying to get her attention. But she's saying, no, kids are not violent. She's kind of ignoring her daughter who's pounding on her.
Yeah.
And I said, Cindy, turn around, take a look at Mara. What is she doing at the moment? She said, oh, yeah. Now, to everyone's surprise, perhaps, it seems that actually over the ages, we have generally become less violent. People think that we're actually more violent, but Steven Pinker has a very good book about that, showing that, yes, the capacity for violence is much more lethal, but with the advent of science and the ability to use scientific reasoning, humans have actually become less violent, I should say, over the generations. But rather than denying that we are potentially violent, by recognizing the potential and by building societies, cultures, ideally the world, that would reduce the acceptability and the use of violence, we may have a chance to not blow ourselves up completely.
Well, I have 3 questions just based on what you just said. So I'm fascinated by the concept of babies and violence because I remember so I have 4 children and they're all adults now. I survived it. I survived raising 4 kids pretty much by myself.
Right.
And I remember one time, similar to what you described at the sink, where I was talking to someone and my kids are just like, mommy, like grabbing me, pulling at me, and just chaos going in the background. 3 of them pulling their hair, pummeling each other. And I'm having just a normal cup of tea with my friend in my living room. And she goes, oh my God, like, how do you get used to it? And I had become tone deaf to the chaos of my children. And the same thing with the violence. And I'm wondering how much society gets tone deaf to the violence that we see, what becomes what we're used to. Like, I grew up with a mother and father who were not physically violent, except one time I saw, but they argued a lot, like the Costanzas on Seinfeld. And I grew up hearing that as the norm. So how much of the way we form what love is in our relationships comes from what we've grown accustomed to, the violence that we see, the arguments that we see? Like, how much as a psychologist can you say we are shaped by the things that we get used to and it becomes the norm?
Definitely, our upbringing and our social environment, both developmentally and currently, are very important with that regard. I mean, take the example of mass shootings. It used to be that we were outraged if, 2 or 3 people got shot and so forth. Now we kind of just accept it as part of the American scene. And to a certain degree, and unless it's a large number of people who were killed, we have become desensitized to it to a large degree. And similarly, in certain subcultures and environments, violence often becomes a way of obtaining status and a way of having to deal with the reality. I recall as a teenager, I had a close friend whose grandfather lived in the Watts area at a time where it was quite violent there. And we were visiting there one Saturday, And his grandfather went on the porch and started just shooting a gun in the air and yelling crazy. And I was, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? Let's get out of here. And my friend said, no, don't worry about it. Just an act he puts on in order for people in the neighborhood to think that he's kind of crazy and very likely to use a gun if anybody disturbs him. But it's actually totally an act.
Yeah.
And in some environments, people have to communicate that they are tough and that they're able to use violence if need be to defend themselves in order to manage in those environments.
Yeah.
But there are many environments in which that's not the case, and many environments we can construct where there are much more acceptable means. And there's a well-known book about 50 societies around the world that do not use violence, that do not have really much conflict. Now, they tend to be small groups that are isolated from other groups. As the Amish are one example in our society, and are protected from the outside by other groups, or they're way up in the Himalayas in places where people can't get to them. And that if anyone is interested, the author is Bruce Bonta, Bonta, and those are kind of pacifist within it. The other thing is that within the society, they totally avoid conflict. Anybody starts a conflict, elders come around, that's back up, no conflict, we don't allow. And they, from a young age, socialize their kids to be really more interested in the welfare of the group than the individual. So for a lot of kids are dancing. Pardon me.
Have there been brain studies on the differences from people in those cultures that didn't have the diet of violence and the way they, develop neuronally compared to others?
It's an interesting question. I don't think they've studied the brains of those people. You don't necessarily have to have different brains. I mean, socialization is a very powerful way of channeling behavior. And if you live in an environment where that's completely controlled, you might not be violent, although, to your point, they do also have an ostracizing mechanism. If somebody doesn't fit in and repeatedly violates the rules, they push them out of the group and they have to leave the setting.
Yeah. Well, the reason I brought that up...
I'm sorry?
The reason I brought that up is I remember talking with you when I was an undergrad, and you had told me about a prison study that you were looking into joining. Did you ever do the prison study where you were looking at the frontal?
No, that's the work of Philip Zimbardo.
I remember you telling me about it.
Right, where he put undergraduate students at Stanford either in the role of prisoners or the role of guards. And after a while, the guards became very much like traditional guards and used violence and used other means of control. And to everyone's amazement, they seem to fall into that role readily. And, that's, again, in some ways you think of it as not surprising. I mean, if you look, let's say, at violence against women, and you look at a society like Japan, actually, the known violence against women in Japan is very low. And if you're a woman walking in Tokyo at 2:30 in the morning at a dark alley, you're generally not at all frightened by the circumstances. But if you ask, what are the greatest number of rapes ever committed in one day? They were in China, in the city of Nanking, where about 100,000 women were raped in one day by Japanese men.
Wow.
Once the society tells them it's okay, and that's the out group, and your violence and your raping is really serving the interests of the society of Japan, and you will not be punished and do what you want, then you can see the same very nonviolent men within the society turn and become very violent to outgroups.
Wow.
So again, coming back to my own learning in the area,
Yeah.
as I said, all these data were pointed out by radical feminists, but there was never really in my mind, or at least once I started reading the evolutionary literature, a clear understanding or a good theory as to why this is the case. And why is it the case that it's generally men who are violent? Why is it the case that even women can support violence, and unfortunately some women will be attracted to violent men, and so forth? The majority of violence, the majority of attempts to control the other sex, to dominate other gender, it's really males, as represented in books like The Demonic Male, which I do recommend, and it's by Robert Wright, and it will give a lot of insights into the evolution of these mechanisms. Now, that doesn't mean that males are necessarily violent or it's inevitable, but it does mean why we have to train from a young age, boys more so than we need to try to teach girls how to engage in nonviolent acts and how to behave in ways that are really dealing with conflict in nonviolent ways.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've been interested in.
Barking there.
Oh, that's okay. We like dogs.
You can edit that. I said, no.
We can wait a second. We can edit this out, right, Scott?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Stage.
Okay.
Okay, hold on.
Okay.
Okay, why don't you guys go in? I'm on the phone, and I told what him to do. Yeah, okay. Go ahead. Come on. So come on in. Okay. Sorry, I have a couple of workmen coming in here.
That's okay.
Okay.
We can wait till you get set back down, and we can edit all that out.
Yeah, I am hoping that you can do that effectively.
Scott is a wizard.
Okay.
Scott and Evan are wizards. Okay. All right. So one of the things that I was really interested in when I was an undergrad was looking at brain structure. So where, I remember learning about the amygdala, and when scientists scarred the amygdala in rats, they became incredibly aggressive. And I remember studying about the prison population where they looked at the brains of it was men on death row, and they found frontal lobe damage, and the impulsivity control was missing. So has anyone ever looked at, with hostile masculinity, brain differences and those structures? Like, where is love in the brain? Is it in close proximity to where the amygdala is, or is it somewhere we can identify where it is? Like, where I'm always interested in the brain development of our behaviors based on that death row study where they found there was a lot of head injuries, there was underdevelopment, that sort of thing that really affected these people's inability to form true loving relationships and to have impulse control issues and to have violent responses. So can you talk a little bit about that? I put a lot in there, but I'm just fascinated by the brain structure and the behavioral outcomes of that.
Right. Well, I think in addressing that question, it's important to distinguish between the use of violence as a species typical behavior, meaning how every person is capable under some circumstances of engaging in violence. And again, talking about books, the Murder Next Door by David Buss is a good
I own that.
book to read about that.
I've got that.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Right. And individual differences in proclivity to engage in violence. So, as I noted before, as a species, we're definitely capable of engaging in violence under certain circumstances. The data that you refer to is more relevant to people within the species who perhaps have either damage to their brains and therefore certain mechanisms that might control or limit violence or might control rage in certain ways are malfunctioning or different from others. and certain inhibitory mechanisms, like perhaps certain kind of empathy, perhaps love under certain circumstances, might be damaged as compared to others within the species. And I would say most violence needs to be understood as a species typical.
Okay.
That is, as I gave the example of Japan, where everyone could engage in it, particularly males, if the circumstances are right and if it's sanctioned by the society. Then you look at within societies, why even though certain environments might not be particularly supportive of or conducive to violence, some people nonetheless engage in that. Mm-hmm. So your examples speak to that part of understanding violence. Mm-hmm. People who may have some damage, or may have certain kind of hormonal, or in many circumstances, just certain developmental experiences that are particularly relevant to that.
Yeah.
And yes, both lines of research are very important, but they really help us understand different aspects of violence.
One of the things that I have struggled with is the reality that you and I have. I think we can agree upon. We're both in a room right now. We're having a podcast. This is a cordial conversation. When it comes to people, you mentioned developmental differences, and we can expand that out to people with mental health issues. I have, unfortunately, my ex-husband, there's some mental health concerns there. And without getting too personal, there's a lot of people out in society, they say 1% of the population has some form of mental illness. They live in a reality that's very real to them. And they really think that we're the ones that have the skewed version of reality. And yet that keeps on getting propagated into the next generation. As an evolutionary psychologist, is the mental health or the mental illness that you see, is that an evolutionary function, or is it epigenetic? I feel like there has to be some adaptation evolutionarily for mental illness. There's a lot of people with bipolar disorder, incredibly smart, incredibly creative. What evolutionary purpose is propagated to the next generation? Because I don't think it's epigenetic. I really fully do believe that this is an inherited condition. It tends to run in families, bipolar disorder, for example. What can you speak as an evolutionary psychologist about that?
Well, as an example of bipolar disorder you mentioned, you could see how in the ancestral environments, and in some cases in current environments, the part that is likely to result in a great deal of productivity and a great deal of the manic part, when it's channeled in a certain direction, can actually be selected for because people who are in the manic phase, but not to the point where they can't function, the contrary, where they may function very effectively, it can have all sorts of consequences that ultimately may contribute in the evolutionary environment to reproductive success. I remember hearing a talk by a famous psychologist who studied manic depressive and herself had a great deal of experience in that. And she would talk about how terrible the depressive episodes were, how she was just on the floor, tremendous pain, but how exhilarating the manic phase was.
Yeah.
And how it was almost worth it.
Yeah.
Not quite, but it was almost worth it. And how he would literally, when she was the manic phase, he would potentially write an entire book in 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
Not sleep at all, but just incredibly productive.
Yeah.
So you can extend that and look at, let's say, sociopathy and such. Well, you can say in many circumstances it's not effective, and people who are sociopaths or psychopaths can get into a great deal of trouble. but you can see if it's combined with a certain level of intelligence, a certain combination of social skills, some of those people become very effective and become leaders in the society.
Right.
And Hitler probably
yeah.
is a good example of that. And, millions of Germans followed him. And without mentioning any names, there may be people in the current political environment who have those characteristics, but it's combined with other characteristics, and the package can be very effective and therefore may have been selected for in evolutionary ancestral environments.
What has that sort of thing evolutionarily taught you about love? Because I've always read that sociopath can't love. But my definition of love is probably very subjective to me, and yours is probably, very subjective to you. And I think there's probably an agreed upon, maybe high level overview of what love is, but it's very different for everyone. And I feel like sociopaths probably do love in the only way that they know how to love, but you and I maybe wouldn't call that love. Like, do sociopaths love?
From an evolutionary perspective, love is what's called a commitment device. Think of it as a equivalent or similar to a lease in an apartment. You might be looking for an apartment, and if you always keep looking for the very best, you'll never settle in any apartment. You'll just keep looking. There's always the potential that the next day there'll be a better prospect for you. There may be a better opportunity. But once you sign the lease, all right, you're going to make the best of it. And you're probably going to convince yourself that that's really the best apartment for you to a certain degree. And you go. Now, similarly, in the mating game, there's always going to be somebody who's better for you. If you think of all the potential mates in the world, no matter who you think for the moment is the best prospect, there's no doubt that statistically there's somebody better. But if you keep thinking that way, you'll never settle, you'll never make a commitment, and you'll never be one of our ancestors, because if it's tied to sex and reproduction, okay, and the raising of children, which in our species very important, and usually in ancestral environments required at least two people. So that lease kind of arrangement or commitment is similar, and psychologists distinguish between what's called passionate love and companionate love. Passionate love is that feeling of exhilaration, that feeling of you got to be with that other person. That person is the best for you, and they're amazing, and you feel a desire for them constantly. And that is what will often result in the commitment. It will result in the bonding. It will result in people thinking of their partner or the person they're in love with as being much better than they really are in some objective way. And that results in commitment, and usually on average lasts about 6 months. It is a good predictor of whether people have sex. It's a good predictor of whether people make a commitment, but it's not a good predictor of whether people stay in for the long haul.
Yeah, but isn't staying in for the long haul also an evolutionary thing because of the investment that you put into the children that, the father's...
It can be. So, and that's where the second type of love, the companionate love, comes in.
Okay.
Now, depending who you are, if you're Genghis Khan and you have access to thousands of women, you have the resources, then you probably will continuously look for the passionate love, and you'll have incredible number of offsprings the next generation. And you don't need the companionate love, so to speak. If you're the typical person in most environments, the companionate love is a much better predictor of long-term relationships and stability and staying. And that companionate love is that feeling of closeness, of intimacy, of wanting to help the other person and be helped by the other person. So if you look at love from that perspective, you can understand, again, with the evolutionary framework, usually people had the passionate love. By 6 months, they would already have become pregnant.
Yeah.
And it's no longer evolutionary selected for to become passionate to that same extent. In fact, it may be contrary to survival and reproduction success, as you noted, because if you're constantly wanting the other person, wanting to have sex with them, you're probably not a very good hunter-gatherer or whatever in getting the resources necessary for the pregnancy to be effective and the rearing of children. So it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective why these two kinds of mechanisms would be in our evolutionary past and why they would be inherited in our brains, and how understanding them can help us use that Stone Age brain more effectively in current environments.
Can love be taught to people like that? So can a culture like you described, the Amish, where they, are peaceful, and if there's anyone who's violent in another culture, they would just kick them out and keep the culture peaceful. So with that same concept, if you have elders, let's say older men in your culture teaching you about love and commitment. Like when I got married, we didn't have marital counseling. And I've talked to people during this podcast, actually, another episode where they went through marital counseling, and I was blown away by how it was the institution where they were going through for their marriage actually built it into the culture. Like they're going to make them go through a college course almost on how to love, on how to be married. Can those people who are probably deemed, bipolar or psychopaths, sociopaths, can they have elders in their community as they're growing up not only teach them how to, whittle and build furniture and, take care of themselves in the future, but can they also can love be taught?
I think a great deal can be taught about love and what people can do to become more successful at it. So just this idea of understanding passionate love and companionate love can help people when they are in the different phases. So for example, when you're in that exhilarating phase, maybe it's not the best time to decide on making a long-term commitment. Maybe you need to wait that 6 months to a year and let that ebb somewhat, where you can really evaluate your partner for long-term kind of commitment. Also, learning how to sustain companionate love can be very important. So, for example, one of the things that has been shown in research to be most likely to undermine relationships is development of hostility or resentment, and how people need, at a very effective way, to, as soon as signs of that appear in the relationship, to find ways of addressing it and not letting it brew, not letting it develop over time. And the opposite end of that is how important it is to learn to have admiration and connection with the other person. So if one person, let's say, becomes interested in birds, and when they're out together, they start pointing out, oh, look at this bird, look at that bird. And the other person has no interest in birds. But to sustain the relationship, first of all, they might want to actually develop some interest and knowledge about it so they can have discussion and support. And the other thing is to just be able to say, oh, yeah, that is an interesting bird, rather than to roll your eyes.
Yeah, the rolling the eyes.
There they go again, or whatever. Same thing, let's say, telling jokes. One person really likes to tell jokes, and when they're company of others, they do that, and the mate has heard those jokes 1,000 times. And if they, oh God, here he goes again, that joke. And the other people, as well as the person telling the jokes, notes in their mind how the mate is really undermining them by having that kind of reaction, that can really undermine the relationship, in contrast to pretending not to have heard the joke and maybe laughing at it. So there are many kind of skills that can be taught on how to make the relationship effective. Also, knowledge about how our evolutionary brains will result in our often being attracted to other people, even if we're in the greatest relationship.
Yeah.
So that you might find, oh, wow, that person looks physically attractive and makes me really at this moment feel a great deal of desire for them. Well, learning both if that happens to you or to your partner, and that's inevitable. That given our psychological mechanisms, that's going to happen, and how to handle it, how to say to yourself, is it worth it that I'm going to, cheat on the person in order to satisfy this temporary, but how's that going to undermine my relationship?
Well, there was
or in terms of jealousy, how you react to seeing your partner show interest in another person, and does that mean that your relationship is necessarily not good or doomed? Well, no. If you understand that those are really inevitable things.
Those are hard things, though. Those are really hard things. Like jealousy is a really hard thing for both males and females. I was reading this story this morning before I came over here about this, the first female spy that MI6 brought on. And her name, I think, was Christina Granville. She was a Polish woman married to a diplomat during the outbreak of World War II. And she did all these incredible things, rescued all these soldiers that were getting ready to be executed. She skied across these mountains and brought in money and collected information. And then at the end, they didn't want her anymore. She was no longer useful. And she was relegated to this ship, working a ship she had previously rowed first class. Now she's cleaning the toilets. And this man on the ship fell in love with her. And she spent her time with him, and she decided he wasn't a good fit. And then he became jealous, not even of another man, just the fact that she had put her a relationship with him aside, and he stabbed her and killed her. This woman survived, World War II, and yet jealousy is what took her down. And I was thinking about that coming over here, like jealousy is one of the hardest things. And, I'm probably as human as anybody else. And if I were with someone and I saw them flirting with someone else, I'm going to admit that even though I'm a secure woman, I'm confident, I wouldn't like that. There's something biological inside of you that you feel like, oh, the thing that I love is, maybe going away. I wouldn't act out in outrage or anything.
Right. Yeah. And when you think of jealousy, again, from an evolutionary perspective, you see it as both functional and dangerous. It is functional as a mate guard, as it's called. So let's say if you're a man in our evolutionary environment and your wife was attracting other men and they wanted to have sex with her, and you said, you know what, okay, just one night, what do I care? And you just look, well, you're not one of our ancestors, because probably it would be cuckold, and you'd probably be raising the offspring of another man, and your genes and your characteristics would not. So it does serve functions for an evolutionary environment. But again, it's one of the things we need to manage, to learn in current environments how it may misfire and how to manage. And yes, it's a bad feeling. I mean, the analogy in many respects that works, I think, pretty well is to think about food and desires for that. So in our ancestral environments, things like ripe fruit were relatively rare. Carbohydrates were hard to get, and so forth. So our psychological mechanisms are designed to take advantage of those as soon as they're in our environment, and to consume as much of it as we can.
Yeah.
In current environments, we have all these so-called parasites, which are the companies that have learned about our taste mechanisms and will create a great deal of temptations because they know they can sell much better the sweets and the carbohydrates and so forth. And if you just respond to those using what you desire, you'll become obese and you'll probably die young from all sorts of diseases associated with it. If you learn about those mechanisms and how you can control your environment and you can control your own responses by, say, not having it at all in the home, making it difficult to access, or never eating desserts, or whatever that may be, your strategy. Similarly, if you anticipate that there's going to be jealousy in your relationship and you talk about it and you learn how to behave in certain ways. So as a man, let's say as one example, you might learn that if you're with your mate, you don't flirt with others in certain ways, or you don't even look in certain ways at other women, perhaps. Or you might learn that if you do so, you want to talk about it with your mate and understand why you're doing it and what's acceptable to her and what's acceptable to you. Yeah. Similarly, a woman, if a man is showing interest in somebody else, or, how to approach that, how to navigate that, how to establish rules for both of you. And here's where gender differences may be important, to learn that what makes men on average more jealous and what makes women on average more jealous is quite different.
Well, that brings in your definition of love. That brings up the definition of love, and we're coming towards the end of the podcast here. But I've asked my mom and dad what their definition of love is, and I've noticed I ask every guest what their definition of love is. And before I tell you what they say, I want to know what your definition of love is.
I told you, I very much think the definition of love needs to be elaborated as what type of love we're talking about. In addition to the distinction between passion and companionate, there are actually, like Sternberg's research will show, 6 types of love, but we won't get into that. And as I said before, the kind of evolutionary approach that thinks of it as a commitment device is, in my mind, a useful way to think about it.
So you take that perspective. So Neil Malamuth's definition of love is commitment.
Is a device that's designed to make you committed.
Okay, device.
I think psychological device. And, when you're feeling it, of course, you feel it quite differently. You feel it as that attachment. You feel it as that exhilarating feeling and so forth. But understanding it, I think, gives you an ability to handle it better than if you didn't understand its functions.
Okay. Well, my dad said his definition of love is service, wanting to make someone else happy, even at his own expense. So it was very service oriented. My dad was in the military, so there's a very, service. Whereas my mom, and I asked her first, so her answer came before his. So he may have had time to think about his answer because they were in the same room. But my mom said that it was a deep emotional feeling that you have for someone. So mom's answer seems to align a lot with the females in my life that have asked, like, it's an internal feeling. It's very of the brain and the heart. Whereas the men, it was mostly about service. And I found that to be fascinating.
Combine the two, and you've got that apartment lease and that house.
You got the apartment?
A deep emotional feeling that wants you to wants you to help serve the other person. So that makes the commitment device exactly on. Of course, you experience it as a deep emotional feeling, but it motivates you to do things that will help you and your offspring.
Yeah. Well, when I was...
help your mate, I say. Not you, but help will make you sacrifice some of your interests in service of your mate and your offspring. I mean, if you think of that from an objective perspective, evolution tricks us by love to do things that are really totally illogical. You said you survived, how many children? 4 children?
4, yeah.
4.
Yeah.
You think of the amount of time, the amount of resources, the amount of suffering that you expended for those children. And your children may be different than most of us today, but in contrast to a lot of earlier environments, I don't think most of us can rely on our children ever giving back any reasonable proportion of what we've done for them.
But that's where love comes in, because I don't expect them to.
Exactly.
Right.
So, but rationally, if an economist were advising you, they'd say, what the heck? You're going to invest all of that resources, all of that. So your brain is tricked into doing it because in ancestral environments, those who experienced love and were tricked into it were our ancestors and have offspring today, where those who said, hell no, I'm going to stay single, or if I'm going to be in a committed relationship, we're not having children.
Nothing wrong with that, by the way. Right. Nothing wrong with that choice.
Right. Well, in current environments, a lot of people think that way. In evolutionary environments, it was not really possible to think that way because people did not know the connection between sex and reproduction and having children.
True.
So if somebody basically didn't want to fall into that, they would have to not have sex at all. And very few people, although there are people who are asexual, there are few people relatively. So in our ancestral environments, it wasn't a decision which people could make.
Yeah.
In current environments, yes, of course they can.
Well, I remember...
But again...
Go ahead.
Yeah. So love tricks you into that commitment device, but it also makes you feel good about it.
Yeah.
It makes you feel fulfilled, makes you feel you've accomplished a great deal. It makes you feel that you've done what you should do and what a fulfilling love could bring. And a lot of people will describe that as the greatest thing they've experienced.
Yeah. Well, this has been an interesting discussion. And after talking with you, I think you need to make your next book, The Evolution of Love. And I think love...
there's already books of that. There's, in fact, with that title, Why We Love, by Helen Fisher by Anna are 2 books that I recommend that will do a lot of that.
I didn't get your second one.
Books that I would recommend if you'd like.
What was the second one?
They're
book?
both titled Why We Love by Anna, A-N-N-A, Machin, M-A-C-H-I-N.
Okay, M-A-C-H. All right.
And the first one is by an anthropologist named Helen Fisher.
Okay.
Both of them are titled Why We Love.
Okay, got it.
And if you're interested in some other books, I would recommend Sex, Murder, and the Meaning of Life by Doug Kenrick.
Okay.
And another book by him is called Solving Modern Problems with the Stone Age Brain. It's actually by his son, David Lundberg Kenrick, and Doug Kenrick.
Okay. All right. I'm writing this down. All right. Well, I think that love should be taught starting in preschool all the way through college. Because
I agree.
We're not that great at it, are we? We're really, as a species, we're not that great at it.
Love and how to deal with rejection, how to deal with hostility, how to engage in nonviolent ways of solving various kinds of problems. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Malamuth Neal. It has been wonderful catching up with you again. And,
likewise.
And I look forward to...
Thank you for your valuable questions.
Yeah, thank you. Well, have a great day. And thank you all for watching Sparks of Love. Have a great week.